Hey everybody, my name is Antranik, and for today's video I'm going to be explaining what is Bitcoin, because Bitcoin has been in the news a lot lately. It's all over the place and most people don't understand what it actually is. They're just getting in it to make money, not aware that they could lose money. And I personally have been in cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin for the past year. I haven't really told anybody about it. You might have known that from a couple videos ago that I was going to make such a video. And another thing you guys might not know about me is that I actually have a degree, a bachelor's degree in financial services. I worked for banks, and I was an insurance agent and a loan officer for several years, actually, all throughout my early to mid 20s. But it turns out that everything that I had learned from all those years in regards to finances comes into play here now for Bitcoin because all of it makes sense to me. And as a teacher, I love to break down complex things. So I'm going to be keeping it simple on purpose, but hopefully not watering it down too much so that you don't lose the essence of why I think this might be one of the greatest innovations since the internet. All right. And since Bitcoin's making constantly new all-time highs, here's this quote by Andreas Antonopoulos. He's one of the most articulate speakers, by the way, and you should definitely check out his work after this video. He says all-time highs attract new people who buy and then get spooked by price dips. Help them to first invest in education about the technology instead of speculation. This is why I'm making this video, because I want to help people to understand what is Bitcoin at its essence. Okay, so let's begin. Bitcoin was created in 2009 by Satoshi Nakamoto. So this comes at an interesting time because right around when the financial crisis was occurring, that's when Bitcoin came about. And basically, Satoshi Nakamoto presented this on an open forum openly. He presented the details for how to create Bitcoin. So this was an anonymous name. We don't know if it's a man, a woman, or a group of people, and it's likely that we will never know. So there's always going to be this mystery of who is Satoshi. Um, but the main thing is that he was able to create the digital equivalent of money. And this was technically impossible before. People tried many times and there were always issues, and he solved many of them just with Bitcoin alone. And the reason he was able to do that was because he was able to merge multiple technologies that existed separately all together. So let's begin with going over what the technologies are. The internet. Obvious, right? Bitcoin uses the internet. We need the internet for Bitcoin to exist. The internet is what allows all our computers to communicate with each other. And just to give a little bit of reference, back in the early 90s, it was impossible for people to explain what the internet or even what email was. And currently, the use and awareness of Bitcoin is at that same level, the equivalent of where the internet was back in the early 90s. The next technology we needed was cryptography, public key cryptography. It's basically a form of encryption that was invented in the 1970s. So it takes basically normal readable information and scrambles it up so that you can't make sense of it at all unless you have the password. It's called a key. So this cryptography or encryption is applied to Bitcoin. And that's why it's also called a cryptocurrency. Cryptography, currency, you get it. And with that said, the only way to access your Bitcoin is if you have the key, which is like a very long password. And if you lose that password, nobody in the world can figure it out because the encryption is so strong. And because of this, actually, Bitcoin has never been hacked. So this is one of its very strong suits. And all the supercomputers in the world combined cannot figure out your private key to access your Bitcoins and steal it from you. So with that said, with that great power and security comes great responsibility. If you lose that password, you lose your Bitcoins, basically, unless you have backups. And because people have very poor practice and password practices and security practices in general. That's why I still believe that we are in the very early stages for Bitcoin. Next, we need to understand what is the blockchain. So, Bitcoin is nothing but a bunch of transactions constantly being recorded down into a log. And they call this log the ledger. It's like an accounting ledger. Okay? Very simple. Bill sends Alice 15 Bitcoins. John sends Anne 3 Bitcoins. And this is just being logged. Alright? And by the way, I used whole numbers, but Bitcoins can be, you can send fractions of a Bitcoin. You can buy a fraction of a Bitcoin. You could buy $1 of Bitcoin. And if Bitcoin goes up by 20% or down by 20%, your dollar goes up by 20% or you know, it moves accordingly. So you don't need a full Bitcoin to have Bitcoin or to reap any of its speculative benefits. All right? So let's move on and continue talking about what is the blockchain and why that's important. So we mentioned that there's a ledger. It's just a log of transactions, right? Now, if we put a bunch of transactions together, it goes into a block. So the block is basically just holds transactions, and it has a limit for how many transactions it can hold. When the block is full, a new block is formed on top of it. So blocks are just containers for these recorded transactions, and they are cryptographically chained together. Basically, each successive block depends on the mathematics of all the previous blocks. And because they rely on each other, once that transaction is complete, it's done. It's irreversible. Everything on the blockchain is irreversible and open for everyone to see. You can't erase anything in Bitcoin's history. The next concept we need to explain is that Bitcoin is decentralized. Now, you've heard this buzzword a lot, probably, decentralized, but what's it mean? So, in essence, it means that there's no central server or authority keeping this log of transactions. Instead, anybody can download the Bitcoin software and start to help to run the network. And the magic here is that every transaction that's ever happened and is happening right now on Bitcoin, all those blocks, all of them are synchronized with every single computer in the world that's running the Bitcoin software. And they're all connected through the internet, and every 10 minutes they get together and synchronize. So Bitcoin is not a company, Bitcoin's not a product, it's not something you sign up for. There's no customer service number for Bitcoin. Also, I just want to iterate this fact that internet.com doesn't represent the internet, right? So the same way, Bitcoin.com does not represent Bitcoin in its entirety. So just throwing that out there as well. And if you're looking for a good site, bitcoin.org is fairly decent. Now, let's explain who is helping to run the Bitcoin network and what is their incentive to doing so, right? Why would they run this? The miners are the computers that are adding the transactions to the ledger and making the blocks. Each time a transaction happens, there's usually a very small transaction fee for making that transaction happen. And the miners, in exchange for helping to run the system, get that transaction fee. And that transaction fee is in the form of Bitcoin. So they basically get a tiny bit of Bitcoin for all the transactions and blocks that they help to create and validate. But these transactions aren't added easily. Why? Because mining Bitcoin requires work, a lot of work. The process of mining Bitcoin and making the transaction happen is purposely, artificially made to be energy intensive and difficult for the computer to create blocks. Any computer that's mining Bitcoin is going to be using a lot of electricity. The fan's going to be whirring, it's going to be maybe hard to use, the computer's going to be hard to use or slow to use, because it takes a lot of math to cryptographically create these blocks and transactions. So the computer that's mining Bitcoin is using a lot of electricity. And in that regard, Bitcoin is not created out of thin air the same way that paper money is. So if if your government is in debt and needs more money, they can just print more money. But for Bitcoins to be mined, a computer needs to work a lot. It needs to work its ass off doing computations to figure out how to finish the transaction and fill the block. So the miners are then rewarded by the fees from those transactions. And the difficulty is so much that it takes like $2,000 in electricity to create one Bitcoin. And this is called proof of work, because literally work needs to be done. Computer work needs to be done to prove and verify the transaction. And this is genius because Bitcoin incentivizes miners in such a way that it capitalizes on human nature's want to make money. And the way Bitcoin is just mathematically coded is that the amount of energy it takes to create that Bitcoin and release it is technically going to pay off, because the value of Bitcoin is going to technically keep going up. So now you might be wondering, how could I say that? How could I say that Bitcoin's value is going to be going up? All right, well, I'll tell you. The law of supply and demand is what ultimately dictates the price. So, since Bitcoin is based on code and mathematics, it was created from the start so that there can only be 21 million Bitcoins, and they're not all available immediately. And every 4 years, the difficulty of mining Bitcoin doubles. All right, so it becomes exponentially harder and harder to mine Bitcoin. And this is why it's called mining, by the way. It's just like mining gold or any other precious metal. Like when you first start mining gold, there's gold everywhere. It's easy to get it out of the ground and it's not too energy intensive. But as time goes on and gold becomes more scarce, it becomes harder and harder to get it. And the price of gold would go up because the supply can't keep up with the demand. Because you can't just come up with gold out of thin air. Not yet anyway, right? So, technology. So, it's made in such a way that it will go up in price due to just basic law of supply and demand. And for Bitcoin, because the difficulty of mining Bitcoin doubles every 4 years and becomes exponentially harder, we won't actually get to 21 million Bitcoins until the year 2141. And if the computers get stronger, faster, we're still not going to get there faster because the difficulty will just adjust faster. So it's an automatic adjustment. Next, Bitcoin will not run into inflation. Inflation is when the purchasing power of your money goes down. Every single paper currency in the world has a little bit of inflation, or a lot, some have a lot, depending how corrupt they are, every year because they just print more of it as they need it, which makes it become worth less. So everyone knows that a dollar 30 years ago was worth a lot more than now. You could buy a lot more with that dollar. And because Bitcoin is limited in supply, it basically will not run into inflation. So Bitcoin has zero inflation technically, because if we compare the value, if we put a price to Bitcoin using a national currency that is naturally inflationary, relatively speaking, Bitcoin is highly deflationary. That means the price of Bitcoin is going to keep going up if money keeps pouring into it. At that point, it will, even devaluate other national currencies, which is a crazy thing to think about, especially in these such early stages. Let's talk more about price. Supply. There are less than 5 million Bitcoins left already, and 7.5 billion people in the world. So if 5 million people wanted one Bitcoin right now, they couldn't get it without making the price go way higher. All right, so just wrap that around your head. Some people estimate, for many reasons, that Bitcoin might be worth $500,000 to $1 million by the year 2020. And I know it sounds outrageous, but the human mind has trouble thinking in exponential terms. We often think very linearly, and this is something beyond what a lot of us could fathom. It's very hard to wrap our minds around such numbers and these concepts alone, right? Now let's talk about another fascinating aspect here. Satoshi Nakamoto was able to make something to be both digital and rare at the same time. So this was something that was never done before, right? So if you take a photo or any file and you want to make a copy of it, you can make as many copies as you want. They'll all be identical and it'll cost you nothing to do it. But with Bitcoin, it takes literal work, computer work, energy, equipment to create Bitcoin. So even though it's digital and people might think it's monopoly money that's created out of thin air, it's not. It's both digital and rare at the same time, and there can only be 21 million Bitcoins. And speaking of monopoly money, it's our national currencies that are literally printed both physically and digitally for almost no cost. So the only thing backing your government's currency is their word and their military. What's backing Bitcoin is proof of work done with mathematics and encryption that is unbreakable. And if you look at this Bitcoin chart, that's actually the chart of US dollars being printed. Those are in the trillions per year. Just to give you a little bit of perspective here. Let's say, what if a miner tries to fake a transaction? How do miners reach consensus? This is a very interesting topic here. I have to explain it because it's very important. All right, sorry if this is boring. So let's say someone tries to fake a transaction. A miner is trying to screw with the system and say that 1,000 bitcoins was sent to me, right? When all the miners come together every 10 minutes to synchronize the blocks, they'll see that something was different about your block and they'll reject it and continue the chain without you. To expand on this further, remember that the miners are constantly using tons of energy to create these transactions, right? They have to follow certain rules. They have to show the signatures are correct. They have to make sure the amounts add up. Does it adhere to all the previous blocks and so forth, right? And if the block is acceptable to all the other miners, then the reward is given in the form of the transaction fee, right? But if someone tries to produce a fake transaction, a lie, okay? If they try to cheat the system, when the calculations are done, they'll see, the other miners will see that something doesn't add up. The signature is not correct. It doesn't adhere to the previous blocks. It means the work was not done. The proof of work is not there. You didn't follow the rules. And then, when that happens, the miners will ignore your block and continue the chain without you. And because they did that, because you didn't adhere to the rules, you will not get any reward in the form of transaction fees. So the people that follow the rules and play fair get rewarded. And the people who try to cheat the system, not only do they fail at cheating, but they lose money as well because they have to pay the electricity bill at the end of the month. And you might think the electricity bill is nothing, but miners are spending millions of dollars in electricity per day to mine Bitcoin. And by the way, you might think, oh, well, that's an exorbitant amount, millions of dollars. Why are they wasting so much electricity? They're not wasting the electricity. That electricity, that use of energy is what gives Bitcoin its security. That is what it takes so that you can't easily just overtake all the computational power and pretend that you're the main chain. Does that make sense? So the power that it takes to run the network is what gives it its security. Now, let's get to my favorite part. Now that we're done with technicals and all that, I hope a lot of it made sense for you. Let's go on with what it means for society. These are awesome. I love this. So let's get into it. First, Bitcoin is trustless, meaning nobody has to trust anybody else for the system to function. That's the thing that's revolutionary about Bitcoin, is that you're able to get millions of people who don't know each other, that can trust each other, to agree on what is the truth, because they are incentivized to do so. So for the first time in history, you have a system where you can trust other people without having to know them. We've never had anything like that in human history. And this is a problem that Satoshi Nakamoto solved, one of the many problems. And with this, you could technically make a worldwide system of money. But money is only the first application. People have to think outside the box, but there could be other uses for such a system. Next, Bitcoin is borderless because Bitcoin is based on the internet. And it doesn't matter what country someone is in because countries don't matter on the internet, right? Bitcoin is permissionless because there's no central authority running this. You don't have to ask for permission to use the system. You don't need to tell anybody that you're going to send Bitcoin from one place to another. It's like electronic cash. It works from person to person, peer to peer. So when you send a Bitcoin, it goes not through an intermediary. It goes directly to that person, and nobody can stop you from doing that. Bitcoin is neutral, meaning it doesn't matter what the religion, gender, nationality, age, ethnicity, financial status, skin color of the person doing the transaction. Like, none of that stuff matters. It doesn't even matter if it's not a person. It doesn't even matter if it's a computer doing that transaction. All right? And if we have AI bots running around one day, you can imagine that they'd be using Bitcoin as a form of money. Think about that. Basically, no one could stop you from accessing or using this technology just because it isn't serving the goals of an organization or institution. It's gonna follow the rules neutrally. So there's no such thing as a good transaction or bad transaction. There's no such thing as a illegal transaction or legal transaction. There's only valid transactions and invalid transactions. And it doesn't matter who the sender is or who the receiver is and what purpose it's for. So in this sense, it's radically neutral. Next, Bitcoin is censorship resistant, probably its most important quality by far. Censorship is basically whenever a government or system tries to prevent you or stop you from seeing something or doing something generally, right? And Bitcoin is censorship resistant, meaning in order for this system to be this decentralized, open, borderless, and neutral, it must be able to defend these properties by making it impossible for anybody to be able to stop Bitcoin or censor Bitcoin. And it does this very well. Nobody, not any government or person, can stop or censor Bitcoin. No one could blacklist it, restrict it. No one could seize the funds. The funds cannot be frozen. And even if a country says that Bitcoin is not allowed, any 14-year-old can look up the code for how to access Bitcoin in like a day. Okay, I mean, it's all there. It's all out there. And the only thing that can stop Bitcoin is really if all the electricity and the internet in the world, all of it, all around the world simultaneously goes down, and all the software is destroyed, and none of the computers are running anymore. That would stop Bitcoin. But if that happens, I think we have much bigger problems than thinking about what happened to our Bitcoins, right? Like, what am I going to eat tonight? Oh, that would be probably a bigger issue, right? So, but if Bitcoin loses its censorship resistance quality, then this whole experiment, if you view this whole thing as an experiment, it will fail, ultimately. This is the most important bit. And by the way, I do view Bitcoin as an experiment. I think that's the healthy way to view it. Next, Bitcoin is a safe haven for any currency that is becoming worthless. So the few Greeks that put their money into Bitcoin when their economy, before they couldn't pull any of their money out, the banks wouldn't give them their money anymore. those people are now very well off, all right? And the same thing is happening in Zimbabwe and Venezuela. Their currency and economy is collapsing. And the few people who are able to put their money into Bitcoin are doing it so that they could secure their future. Like they want to secure all the value that they have built up throughout their lives before their money becomes worthless. And if you live in the United States, you might think, this will never happen to me. But if you talk to anybody in Argentina, they understand very well what it's like to have your currency collapse. So don't underestimate where this is going. Trillions of dollars will easily pour into Bitcoin whenever a currency starts to collapse. And they'll be doing that so that they can control their future against despotic governments and corrupt banks that are basically stealing from them or have been stealing from them. This basically gives people the opportunity to control their future. Next, a lot of people don't realize how disruptive this technology is going to be. Bitcoin is going to do to the banking and finance industry what the internet has done to everyone else, to every industry that has ignored it. It's going to render them useless, basically. It's going to do the same thing that cars did to the horse and buggy. It's going to do the same thing that Uber did to taxis, and the same thing that Airbnb has been doing to hotels. Bitcoin is a whole new asset class. An asset class is something like gold, stocks, real estate, cash. These are all just different asset classes. And Bitcoin is a whole new asset class. Once you understand what Bitcoin is fundamentally, you cannot stop it. It's just mathematics. Once people understand how it works, it's just science. You can't put a stop to science. Now, with all this said, Bitcoin is still in the very early stages. Even though it's in the news and all that, adoption, the actual use of Bitcoin is still very low and it's still very early. It's like in the 80s, whenever you wanted to send an email, only tech savvy people could do that. And right now, Bitcoin is at that level where only tech savvy people have been in it. But what happened 20, 30 years later is that you can send email with a swipe. That is pretty revolutionary. We've come a long way. So don't underestimate where this is going. Don't listen to the people that say Bitcoin is only for drug dealers and gamblers and whatever else, right? Younger people grasp how revolutionary this is more than most older people, unfortunately. And remember that I've tried to make it much simpler than it actually is. Every single facet that I've talked about has a rabbit hole of information. But I hope that this was enough information for you to get a feel for what Bitcoin is fundamentally without watering it down too much. I recommend you also watch Andreas Antonopoulos' videos. He's very good, probably one of the best. I thank you for watching and I'll see you next time. Please leave a like or dislike, leave a comment, tell me why you liked it or didn't like it. Subscribe if you're new to my channel, unsubscribe if you hate me, don't want to see me ever again. I don't really care. Thank you for watching and over and out.